Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are, and welcome to our webinar on wildfire risk and resilience, using data to mitigate risk for the most vulnerable populations. Next slide. My name is Erica Manuel. I'm the CEO and Executive Director of the Institute for Local Government, and I will be your moderator today. And before we begin today's session, I just want to go over a few housekeeping items while everyone is signing on. We are recording today's webinar, and we're going to share that recording and any related resources with all the registrants following the webinar. Next slide. All of your lines have been muted, and I think you got that notification when you signed on. You're going to be muted for the duration of the webinar, but you can ask a question at any time by typing it into the questions box on the right-hand side of your screen. If you have any technical difficulties during this session or any questions of our panelists during their presentations, please feel free to use that function. Next slide. So today's webinar is on wildfire risk and resilience. And as we know, our nation's risk from wildfires and other natural disasters really continues to increase despite COVID. And when homes and businesses and infrastructure are destroyed, our society is at risk of wide-scale shutdown. Wildfires have become more expensive and damaging in recent decades, costing billions of dollars every year. And unfortunately, those long-term impacts of these wildfire disasters are felt most acutely at the local level. The data suggests that more than 45% of recovery and restoration costs are borne by cities and counties and small businesses and property owners. And until recently, we realized that many communities really had no way of quantifying their wildfire risk. But luckily, there is a new tool. It's called Wildfire Risk to Communities that has been specially designed to help local elected officials, community planners, fire managers, and others really understand how risk varies across a state, across a region, or across a county to prioritize mitigation activities to reduce that risk. So in today's webinar, we're going to learn how to use this tool. And we're also going to hear from local agency leaders from across the country who are building wildfire resistance now. They're using data to mitigate risk for the most vulnerable populations in their communities, and they're responding to and adapting to population migration from neighboring communities, even given that wildfire risk and the disasters they're facing. So our goal today is to help you explore some options for leveraging data and effective planning to protect and prepare your communities. And we know that COVID response and recovery has been the major priority for local agencies this past year. But as we move deeper into our traditional fire season, many of us are seeing the signs of danger coming. We have to remain vigilant and remember that there are concurrent threats to our communities, and today's webinar is designed to address that. Next slide, please. This is the agenda for today's discussion, and we're so lucky to have an incredible cohort of local government experts with us this morning. We're going to hear first from Carolyn Coleman, the Executive Director of the League of California Cities, or Cal Cities, who has set the stage and is going to talk to us about kind of the framing for this discussion. And then we're going to hear from some of our panelists. They're all local agency wildfire experts through their personal and their professional experience. We have Adam Hanks and Chris Chambers with the City of Ashland, Oregon. We have Justice Jones with the City of Austin, Texas, and Mary Joyce Ivers with the City of Ventura. And then we're going to take a virtual tour of that new tool that's now available for local governments to use. And Kelly Pale with the Headwaters Economics Group will guide us through that resource. And then we're going to end with a Q&A. Next slide. We see that a lot of you have joined us today. We're so excited. So if you are just joining, I wanted to go over that process for answering questions one more time. If you have any questions during the webinar, whether it's for our panelists or about technical difficulties, please use the questions box and not the chat box. The team behind the scenes is going to be going throughout the webinar to review your questions, make sure that if you have technical difficulties, we handle those right away. And then we also make sure that we're collecting all of your questions for our panelists so that we can answer those during the Q&A portion of our session. Next slide. Now, before we dive into the panel, I did want to tell you just a couple things about ILG. As I mentioned during my intro, I am Erica Manuel, the CEO and Executive Director of the Institute for Local Government. We are a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization, and we are here to help local government leaders in California. We are the nonprofit training and education affiliate of 3 statewide associations representing California local governments, the League of California Cities, or Cal Cities, CSAC, and the Special Districts Association. Together with those 3 affiliates, we serve over 2,500 local agencies that include cities, counties, and special districts in California. We provide practical and easy-to-use resources so local agency leaders can effectively implement policies on the ground. Everything we do centers around helping local leaders navigate complexity in their roles. And that's kind of one of the reasons why we're so excited about this webinar today. There are few things more complex than preparing a community for a natural disaster or a wildfire, especially in the middle of a pandemic. Next slide. ILG has 4 main program areas or pillars of work: leadership and governance, civics education and workforce, public engagement, and sustainable and resilient communities. And really our goal is, again, navigating complexity, increasing capacity, and building trust. We offer deep technical assistance and capacity building. And as many of you know, climate change is this escalating threat that's having a dramatic impact on the economies, the health, and the way of life in California and across the country. The work that ILG does in our Sustainable and Resilient Communities program is really designed to help local leaders with the resources and the relationships they need to address difficult decisions around land use, infrastructure, public services, and community resilience. We also have tools, programs, and resources to help local governments integrate equity and resilience into mitigation and climate programs. Please visit our website for more information. Next slide. I am so excited to be moderating this webinar today and want to give special thanks to our webinar co-host, the National League of Cities and Headwaters Economics. All right, so now that I've told you about just a little bit about us, we want to know who's on the line today. We cannot see your faces, but we definitely want to know who's on the line and what roles you play, right, in this space. So we do have a really short poll question that we hope will help our panelists better plan for our discussion and your questions. We have a poll queued up for you, and we're hopeful that you can see that information on the screen in just a second when we launch it. You should be seeing right now the first question, which is, what best describes your relationship to local government? Are you staff? Are you an elected official? Are you a consultant? Are you a community-based organization or nonprofit partner or other? Please go ahead and click on those radio buttons, the one that best reflects your role, and we will get a sense of who's on our line today. Excellent. Okay, we're going to go ahead and close that poll in just a couple seconds. All right, let's close the poll and we'll show you those results in just a few moments. It should pop up in a minute. We are looking at over half of you are staff at a local agency. That's fantastic. About 10% of you are elected officials. About a little less than that are consultants and others as well. So we have quite a strong group today, and certainly we're excited for your participation at whatever level you're in. Thank you for that, and thank you for being here. Next slide. So as I mentioned, we are joined today by quite a few panelists with firsthand experience and knowledge of wildfire risk and resilience. And before we hear from them, we're going to hear from someone I get the privilege of working with quite often. Her name is Carolyn Coleman. She is the Executive Director of the League of California Cities, or Cal Cities. Carolyn has an incredibly unique perspective on this issue because she represents more than 450 cities in California that are struggling with these very topics day in and day out. But she also serves on the board of the National League of Cities and has a wealth of experience supporting cities from the national stage. She also serves on the ILG board. So Carolyn is here with us today to set the tone for our conversation and provide a welcome in the context of her numerous roles. Carolyn, thank you so much for being here today.
Good morning, Erica. Thank you for the warm introduction and for inviting me to spend just a few moments with all of you this morning. It is truly great to have you on the call to discuss, I know, an issue that is near and dear and so important to all of our cities here in California. You know, over the last several years, it seems like each summer has brought an increasingly devastating wildfire season to our state. And if the pandemic wasn't enough in 2020, it was probably on record one of the more devastating seasons in terms of wildfires for our city. So very timely to be on the call today. As all of you know, regardless of the role and the connection you have with local governments, the impacts of the wildfires are felt in our communities, among our residents, our small businesses, and our local economies suffer as well. And that's why over the last several years, it has been a top priority for Cal Cities to forge a strong partnership with the state that is focused on strengthening community disaster preparedness, resiliency, and recovery for our communities. These efforts are more important, even more important today, as we unfortunately enter a third dry season and increasing drought conditions across the state. Cities all over California, and you all know this better than most, need support, we need tools, and we need resources to ensure that all of our communities are prepared and ready for any disaster, whether natural or man-made. And this will continue to be a focus for Cal Cities and I know ILG in the foreseeable future. And that's why today I'm pleased that two of our strongest partners, the Institute for Local Government and NLC, the National League of Cities, are hosting today's webinar. As Erica mentioned, Cal Cities is a founding partner of ILG, and for more than 65 years, our two organizations have worked together to provide local leaders with the resources and tools and practical advice to help them strengthen their communities. ILG's resources and the services they provide are invaluable to the local agencies they serve. Cal Cities is one of, and I want to switch and talk about NLC here for just a second. It just so happens that Cal Cities, besides being a founding partner for ILG, is also one of 10 state leagues nationwide who came together in 1924 in Lawrence, Kansas, to create the National League of Cities. It's very special to me since Lawrence, Kansas is my hometown, but I assure folks that I was not there in 1924 at that first organizing meeting. I want to thank NLC and Anna, you for helping us bring together today's session and for all of the work that NLC has done over the last year to help get the American Rescue Plan across the finish line. Certainly the resources in the American Rescue Plan can also be put to use, helping ensure our communities are resilient as we prepare for another wildfire season. Just so happens also that before coming to Cal Cities in 2016, I served as NLC's Director of Federal Advocacy in Washington, D.C. So I am pleased to continue my work and my partnership with that organization. As Erica mentioned, besides my work here at Cal Cities, I am honored to serve on both ILG's board as well as NLC's. And I truly believe and sincerely believe that the webinar that they are bringing forward today is just one example of the kind of value that we bring to city officials amongst the three organizations when we work together. So thank you all again for being here today. It's an important topic. You'll have, I think, great information, a great new tool that will be unveiled. And I want to say thank you so much to Erica for having me today. Have a great session.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. So that was a really thoughtful overview of the landscape sort of as you know it and as what many of us are experiencing it across the local government landscape. And Carolyn speaks with experience from the national level, but also the statewide and California level. But this is a webinar that also reflects a number of other states. And so we're excited to see kind of what's happening on the ground. How is implementation working on the ground? And we are really blessed to have some phenomenal panelists today in our webinar. We're joined by 5 experts with a wealth of knowledge to share with you that'll complement some of what Carolyn already presented. In alphabetical order, we have Chris Chambers, the Wildfire Division Chief of the City of Ashland, Oregon, Adam Hanks, the City Administrator with Ashland, Justice Jones, the Wildfire Mitigation Program Manager with the City of Austin, Texas, Mary Joyce Ivers, the Deputy Public Works Director with the City of Ventura, and that's in California, and Kelly Pale, the Associate Director of Headwaters Economics. In the interest of time, I'm going to dispense with their full bios so we can hear directly from them about their recent and relevant experience with wildfire risk and resilience. But the first 4 panelists that I named, they're going to talk about their experience in local government, navigating the ins and outs of preparedness, response, and recovery. They're also going to talk about resilience and mitigation And then Kelly's going to share some information about a phenomenal tool that is now available for local governments to help with on-the-ground implementation. And then during our Q&A, we're also going to be adding a guest from the U.S. Forest Service. Frank Fay is a fire ecologist with the Fuels and Fire Ecology Program, joining us for questions you may have at the end. So to all of our panelists today, I'd love to say welcome and thank you for being with us today and this morning if you're in California or on the West Coast. And I'm just really excited to begin our discussion and hear from all of you. We do have a large panel today, so we're going to start by going in order, and I'm going to ask each of you to just give us an overview, right, of your community's experience with wildfire and what your agency is doing in the area of risk mitigation and resilience. We're going to start with Justice Jones in Austin, and then we'll go to Mary Joyce in Ventura, and we'll end with Chris and Adam in Ashland. And Justice, we would love for you to just kick us off with a little bit about background about what's happening in Austin and specifically as it relates to our topic related to resilience, data, vulnerable populations. Fill us in on what's happening there.
Thank you, Erica. And I'm honored to be here and part of such an esteemed panel of subject matter experts and happy to share our story and our journey to becoming a community that's more adapted to wildfire than we have been in the past. A little bit of background on Austin. It's experiencing high velocity growth. We have over 150 people plus moving to Austin today, and our population is bumping up against 1 million in the city and 2 million in the county. So we have an extensive population exposed to wildfire risk. 2011 was really the dawn of wildfire awareness in Austin, and really Texas as a whole. It's the worst wildfire season in Texas history. Right down the road from Austin occurred the worst wildfire in Texas history, the Bastrop Fire, which really opened people's eyes to the enormity of the risk wildfire poses to our communities, our natural resources, and the things that we value. Austin is very much a grassroots-oriented community and driven by grassroots efforts. So we recognized early on that collaboration was going to be the key to any success we had in mitigating the potential impact of wildfire. So we started our efforts by forming a wildfire coalition with the task of developing a community wildfire protection plan. That plan outlined mitigation strategies that we are working to implement today. The key element of that plan is it was collaborative. We engaged numerous departments from across the city and county and the state and federal level. Anybody that we thought could contribute to effective mitigation plan for the city. And equally as important, the plan was adopted by both the City of Austin Council and Austin and Travis County Commissioners. So our wildland urban interface doesn't stop at the city border, like many of you know. So it made the most sense to us to work collaboratively with our partners in the county to ensure that we had the most comprehensive protection possible for the City of Austin. The first step in the risk assessment process for us was defining the values that we are most concerned with that could be impacted by wildfire and looking at non-traditional approaches for accomplishing that. We factored in things like the proximity of our structures to one another and the potential for structure conflagration, the proximity of homes to areas where embers can travel well ahead of the wildfire and ignite structures on the interior of our community. And so we did a really deep dive to understand what that risk was, because we wanted a common operating picture that we could all move forward together collectively. Through that risk assessment process, it was evident that while wildfire was a major impact to Austin's values, and it's not just evident through our local assessment, it can be echoed at the state and now the national level with the great work that Headwaters Economics has done. Out of that CWPP and that collaboration came some priorities. The first priority was to ensure that we're protecting life safety. And so we focused on planning for events that could impact that, such as developing the first city-county wildfire evacuation plan in the state of Texas. Next, we focused on how can we push our efforts of becoming a fire-adapted community down to the local level. And we formed an alliance of our FireWise communities throughout the city. We lead the state in the number of nationally recognized FireWise sites. And we wanted to make sure that we were empowering residents to rise up to meet the threat of wildfire as we were working at the city and county level to do what we could do to prepare our community. So we wanted to ensure that we had action on both sides of the fence, if you will. We worked really closely with other departments as our process to identify the risk and how to build resiliency into the city. One of the key efforts that we did in our planning for wildfire was engage with Headwater Economic and participating in the Community Planning Assistance for Wildfire program. That really gave us a roadmap for how we could address wildfire from a regulatory standpoint, and we are working to implement those recommendations to date. One of the biggest accomplishments related to the Community Planning Assistance for Wildfire recommendations and our CWPP was the adoption of the Wildland Urban Interface Code. We're the largest municipality outside of California to have adopted that code, and we added additional measures to the code that protect homes not just directly adjacent to wildland, but up to 1.5 miles from those wildland areas from embers, which we know are one of the greatest threats to our communities. We worked with our Firewise Alliance to develop local level CWPPs and support those communities in implementing the CWPPs that they've developed, and we've helped them with the implementation of, including engaging city partners, land managers, and others to be a part of that. We also work to restore our landscapes, ensure that they're resilient from the impacts of catastrophic wildfire. We do this through things like integrating fire management into our land management plans, conducting prescribed fires whenever we can and wherever we can safely and effectively, and strategically mitigating vegetation adjacent to communities at risk, starting with city property, because we knew that was our first priority. We also want to make sure that we responded as effectively as possible to the next fire season as it arose. So we've trained all of our Austin Fire Department firefighters in wildland firefighting, and we're working to elevate many of our staff to higher levels of wildland fire qualification. So when that threat does reemerge, they can rise to the cause, but also ensure that we have firefighter and public safety as our highest priority. We also learned that if you're not telling your story effectively, you're not going to be able to reach as many people as you need to. As I mentioned, Austin's got hundreds of people moving a day. Traditional methods of one-on-one contact might not be as effective for us as they are in maybe smaller communities. One of the things we've done is develop a wildfire clearinghouse or a hub of all the work that ourselves, our partners in the city and county are doing to reflect that back to the public, but it also has components where the public can participate in developing their mitigation strategies. So it really takes leadership intent, staff that are aligned with protecting community values, regardless of their role, whether they're natural resource managers or public safety. Wildfire can affect all of our values, and a community that's empowered and engaged to confront the threat of wildfire owns their personal responsibility and takes action to reduce risk to themselves and their families. That's our abridged version of our resiliency plan for wildfire now and into the future.
Justice, thank you so much for that overview. I'm certain we're going to have a lot of questions for you towards the end of this presentation, but we're going to come back and learn a little bit more about Austin in just a few. But first, we're going to hear from our friends in Ventura. Mary Joyce Ivers, would you like to tell us a little bit more about what Ventura is doing? You've certainly had some personal experience with wildfire over the last few years, and we'd love to see what you've learned from that, how that experience has shaped the work that you're doing now and moving into the future.
Yes, thank you, Erica. December 4th, 2017, we were all in a council meeting with our new mayor being inducted, and all of a sudden we started getting the calls. I was acting director at the time, and we immediately had to open up the Emergency Operations Center. It was a fire that was going 80 miles per hour, which was a football field a second, and it was just coming towards our community very quickly. One of our wonderful, impressive public safety, fire, and police, they were able to evacuate 27,000 people from the hillsides literally within hours, and it saved a lot of lives, and we were very blessed that we did not lose a life during that immediate response. We have 111,000 population. We're located an hour north of LA and a half hour south of Santa Barbara. So it's wonderful when you've got all those leaders all throughout your organization. Everybody stepped up. They knew what they needed to do, whether closing streets, addressing the water levels, supporting the fire departments. We had over 8,000 firefighters come into our mutual aid agreement within our city to help from 22 states. And those are really critical partnerships that we do need to maintain. One of the supplies, getting supplies, one of the critical supplies was fuel. So we were able to get that fuel supply to help support these agencies as they were setting up their base camp and addressing this fire. We've learned a lot from this, and we know that we need to implement things that are more resilient. So next slide, please. I just wanted to share a personal story just because it does impact you when it comes to your community. It is frightening. This is my neighborhood, about 2 blocks from my home. Thankfully, my home survived. We lost half our homes within our neighborhood and our hillsides. We lost over 550 homes and then other damage throughout the city. And so we immediately identified that, took inventory, figured out where the damage was. Our building and safety team came together after our public safety, police, and fire did what they needed to do. You know, our relationships with the federal level, we had the National Guard come in to help protect and support us. We were able to set up community areas where the people, sadly, that lost their homes and everything, people evacuated 9, 10, 11 at night and didn't have their IDs or anything. And so they had to get all that information reestablished and start talking to their insurance companies and figuring out where could they go, what could they do, how could they rebuild. Our city did quickly put in the emergency declaration, but also helping our families try to rebuild and get back on their feet. And it's great to see that we have over 350 homes that have been rebuilt and the families moved in. Evaluating our codes and policies with the building code. A lot of the homes are built, they don't have the eaves where a lot of the fire embers had gotten and caused the fire. So a lot of great resilient building construction efforts were implemented to help protect homes in neighborhoods, as well as our drought tolerant landscaping, clearing the landscaping from homes. So a lot of great construction methods have been implemented within these newer built homes and newer developments that are coming in. So next slide, please. So this was a summary of the structures. Over 18,000 structures were threatened. We had over 535 homes lost, as well as other structures. The evacuation, I still think, was so impressive. And we sadly, for a little bit of time, we were the largest wildfire in California at 281 acres, and that has since passed. One story with building relationships through the National League and the Institute of Local Governments. We're all in this together, especially during this latest emergency. Sean from the city of Santa Rosa, the city manager, again, had flown down to help us figure out what do we do next. And that was really helpful to know how to address the response time. Then we went into recovery. Next slide, please. And our recovery was figuring out how to rebuild our community, what we needed to do to get our buildings safe, putting in those critical continuity of business, reopening our city hall, providing the resources to our community, building that confidence that we are all here to help our community to rebuild and to give them the resources we need. So some of the lessons learned was the communication was so critical, and that's what we continue to build upon with our communication systems to all our communities and the lower populated and higher populated areas. In fact, today we got our public safety power shutoff notice from our electric company just to ensure that we're testing our communications. That is something that has been implemented, and we are taking mitigation efforts to have emergency generators installed for the necessary critical infrastructure such as water and providing the services and streets and evacuation routes. Our police department just put in new sirens into their vehicles so that it is for sure an evacuation notice for helping get people to safety during an event. We continue with our shared responses with our local agencies, working together, building our relationships, having really good agency collaboration, helping get the right tools and equipment to our firefighters and our police department and our public works and our community services throughout our community to have what they need to do to be resilient and mitigate the potential for wildfire. We have our controlled burns, we have our debris flow models and management that we evaluate and taking proper measures to making sure that we do have proper debris flow in the future. Sadly, it was 3 weeks after the Thomas fire that we had the Montecito mudslide that lost a lot of lives, sadly, and that was just 12 miles north of us up the road. And then we've also strengthened our emergency services manager position and really looking at our after action report, learning from the past and what we can do for the future with our lessons learned. Next slide, please. So some of those is, we've got our power safety shutoffs, taking the proper precautions for that and making sure we're staging people where we need them, being prepared if the power goes off and how we can have the right water infrastructure. We're improving our communications citywide as well as with our utility companies. We've been able to get through grants as well as other funding sources, extra emergency generators throughout. So we have our emergency operations centers at multiple locations if needed. We've got our water, sewer, street lights running. We've upgraded our communication and controls with our water systems, upgrading all our sites so that we can be functional in the case of a disaster and what that looks like, having the proper safety supplies and equipment, making it necessary, and then looking at what we need to do to make our facilities stronger and more resilient. We are in the process, thankfully, with the funding and the grant program for our climate action plan that we are working on our general plan this year. Our last general plan was 2005, and a lot of things have changed with our population, with more frequent wildfires, the high temperatures causing our electricity and power grids to go down. So we're engaging our stakeholders in the community. We're getting information of what their vision is for our city and what that looks like, what we can do. And we're working on our energy action plan and our climate action plan to look at ways we can be safer in delivering our services, reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, being more sustainable and conservation, and really improving a safe, healthy, and walkable community for all. So that was some of what happened to us and our lessons learned and how we're looking forward to creating that plan and being more resilient in the city of Ventura. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary Joyce. That was a really phenomenal overview, and we're so sorry that that's happened to your community, but we're so grateful that you're able to share some of the experiences and the lessons learned that you've experienced and how you're integrating that, right, as we talk about data and we talk about resilience, and specifically those vulnerable communities. And maybe those of you that are listening or watching that aren't necessarily at that stage yet and need this guidance, that we're hopeful that if you're at the very beginning, that you understand and learn from our panelists how to proceed in your communities. Our last set of panelists is a wonderful group. We're going to stop the share and we're going to hear from the city of Ashland. We have two presenters, Chris and Adam, are going to give a quick overview of what they've done in Oregon and how have taken the information they have around displacement and landscaping and some of the other specifics related to their community as it relates to this topic. So Adam's going to kick us off and then we're going to go to Chris.
All right, thank you very much. Glad to be here. My role is just a few minutes. I'll give a little kind of program background and support information from my seat, which is the city administrator slot. Really about, we have a somewhat mature program. So I'm just going to give a couple little tidbits about kind of lessons learned and the value of how we've put that together so far to have a wildfire prevention and adaptation program. Some of the key elements is, developing a solid and long-term revenue stream to fund kind of the foundational work, which is dedicated staffing. I think that's always a challenge, is to everybody will have a community value for developing these programs. The staffing component is critical. Having that be a consistent and reliable staffing program is just essential. It provides the ability to leverage other funds, external funds, which are a critical component to making all of this work, especially in a smaller community like ours. It is also essential, a big part of having that stable in-house staffing is to foster those relationships and collaborations that Justice mentioned earlier in their community efforts. We have that same thing. We're a relatively small community. We're in the Rogue Valley. It's essential that we work collaboratively beyond our boundaries and our operations. Then the other piece that I think we've been really successful with is building a support structure for that in the community interfacing. So we have a dedicated commission, an advisory body to the council that takes a little bit of the focus and pressure off the council from the ongoing detailed work and really allows some really organized and solid citizen involvement. There's some really great technical people that also are on there, as well as general citizens that can really help staff and actually augment staff work. And then it's also just that ongoing vehicle for citizen involvement, interaction, support, advocacy for what we're doing. And the last piece that I'll mention before handing off, that it'll become obvious when I hand it off, is hire awesome people. Chris Chambers will come speak about all the actual details of what we do. It's critical to have skilled professionals on your staff, and it might require a few extra dollars. Absolutely well worth it. We need to retain them. You need to leverage them. You need to let them do their thing and build that structure and foundation for them to be successful. So that's probably the overriding plug. Is there's a lot to all this stuff, and having people like Chris for us is just invaluable. Can't do it without quality professional staff. So with that, I'll hand it over to Chris to talk about more of our details of our programs and projects.
Hi, everyone. Really good to be here. I think Adam just said I'm eligible for a raise. I'm reading too far into that. So some of what's made Ashland successful in building our wildfire program, which turned into a division in our fire department about 10 years ago, has been using the model of the National Wildland Fire Cohesive Strategy. The cohesive strategy starts at the federal level, ties in all 50 states, and then the local levels as well. And it presents a really nice model for integrating three really foundational facets of wildfire, which are resilient landscapes, fire-adapted communities, and then the effective fire response. So tying those things together for us has been a really convenient way both to design our programs, but also to match that program up with state partners, county partners, all the way up to our federal partners. So Ashland has focused a lot of effort in the resilient landscapes. We have a forested watershed that sits above town that's highly prone to wildfire, has experienced wildfires in the past, and we know if we experienced a severe, uncharacteristic fire in our watershed, it would have millions, if not tens or even $100 million of damage to our infrastructure, as well as our potential to deliver clean, clear water to citizens. And through a tourist-based economy, that's really important for us to have a secure water source. So we've partnered with the U.S. Forest Service for over 10 years now in a stewardship agreement. We brought in nonprofit partners into that agreement as well. And now over $30 million later and 13,000 acres of treated landscape where we've done fuels reduction, we do prescribed burning, we did helicopter-based thinning of trees, and we have a lot of workers on the ground, which supports our local economy in addition to lowering fire danger. So that's been one of the success stories of Ashland, is being able to integrate the landscape, but also bringing in the fire-adapted communities piece to that. So that's all the work that we're doing inside our city in what would traditionally be called the Wildland Urban Interface, or WUI. But in Ashland's case, and I think this is the case of a lot of cities, one of our lessons learned from the recent Alameda fire, which actually started in Ashland but burned portions of our adjacent communities, Talent and Phoenix. Over 2,500 structures and businesses were lost last September 8th. Is don't ignore areas that you wouldn't traditionally think of as fire prone. There's a tendency, at least on the West Coast, and especially as you get up into timber country in Oregon and Washington, to think that, oh, it's fires only happen in the forest or, you know, in vast grassland areas. Well, what we learned from this fire is fires happen in city parklands, in greenway areas, and they move into the urbanized areas of communities and burn through neighborhoods and into business districts. So the fires that we thought of, most of us growing up and seeing them in the hills and staying in the forest, that's not the case anymore. And assessing fire risk across a community, which hopefully the tool that's going to be talked about will help many communities do that, is focusing not just on those interface areas, but looking at a broader spectrum of where fire can come from and where fire can go and how it can impact your community. That's led in Ashland to implementing codes that have been really effective. Actually, the last code adoption in Ashland just happened a week and a half ago through the City Council. That's updating our building code, so we're building fire-resistant structures. But we did implement a landscaping code in 2018, which included a prohibited flammable plants list. So basically, all the bad stuff that causes fire problems that people plant around their homes is no longer allowed to be planted in the city. We've worked with local arborists, with those folks who sell plants at all kinds of stores around our valley and inside our community, to let folks know that if we see these plants planted newly around structures, we're going to require the owners to remove them. So it's been an education process, but a really effective one. And Ashland's been able to integrate FireWise communities. We've had an extremely successful FireWise communities program, and recently leveraging, as Adam mentioned, our staffing and our investments to get a FEMA pre-disaster mitigation grant for $3 million that we just executed a couple weeks ago with FEMA and through our state emergency managers. And now we're going to keep working on that grant for the next 3 years. So a lot of successes, though we know that we still have a long way to go here in Ashland, but we look forward to working more with our community and our partners to make Ashland a safer community. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. And to all of our preliminary panelists that have talked about what's happening in their communities, what you've done since you've experienced a wildfire disaster, and how you are utilizing both collaboration with other partners, grant funding at all levels, and then implementing policies and procedures and codes that can really help with that resilience moving forward. We are just getting started, and I'm already seeing lots and lots of wonderful questions in the questions box. We are collating them and curating them for the next part of our conversation. And before we get to those questions, we are going to have our final panelist, Kelly Pale, give us a little bit of an overview of this tool that we've been talking about, because the conversation today is not just about what has happened and how people have responded to that, but also what you can do as it relates to utilizing data for that conversation. So we've heard from these three communities that are doing just this, but a lot of organizations and communities lack the time and the resources and that data. And so Kelly's going to talk to us about a new tool that's available specifically for local agency leaders that is really about kind of mitigating and really focusing on resilience. So Kelly Pale, she's the Associate Director of Headwaters Economics, independent nonprofit research organization. She's in Bozeman, Montana, and she's been working on fire ecology, conservation, outdoor recreation, and community development for over 20 years. We're so excited to have you. Kelly, the controls are all yours.
Thank you, Erica. It's really an honor to be here today with all of these panelists. And thanks to ILG and the National League of Cities for hosting today's webinar. I'm really delighted to share with you today this tool, and I'll share my screen in a second. And I want to mention that I'm joined by Frank Fay, who's the National Fire Ecologist with the U.S. Forest Service, who will jump in and take the hard questions that you might have about this tool. This was a tool developed under the direction of Congress. Congress directed the Forest Service in the 2018 Omnibus Act to publish a nationwide map to inform communities of their wildfire risk. And the Forest Service teamed up with Pyrologics, which did some of the under the hood wildfire risk mapping and modeling that I'll show you here, and with us at Headwaters Economics to develop a easy to use, very accessible website to give access to communities across the country, give access to these data to communities across the country. It was really designed with communities in mind. So elected officials, land use planners, fire personnel, to help understand relative wildfire risk. You can use the data here to prioritize mitigation efforts to the most vulnerable communities. You can identify places where localized data and information might be needed, and you can use it to find strategies to help mitigate risk. So I'll share my screen. I want to share with you the Wildfire Risk to Communities tool, which you can find at wildfirerisk.org. There are three main pathways into this website, which you can see here on the homepage. The Understand section includes information about the components of wildfire risk and some of the data and the science behind how wildfire risk is mapped and modeled. So you can go here to understand more about the building blocks of wildfire risk. I'll show you the reduce section in a little bit, and that includes a lot of resources that can help you find ways to manage and mitigate wildfire risk. There are videos, handouts, links to community partners and resources that can help you manage and mitigate risk. Really adapting from the three pillars of the cohesive strategy that Chris just mentioned: wildfire response, fire adapted landscapes, and or resilient landscapes, excuse me, and fire adapted communities. But the Explore section is what I really want to share and demonstrate with you today. This is where you can access specific data for your communities. When you click on Explore, you can go to any community, county, or state in the country. So you just start typing the name of your community and you'll find it in a drop-down list. And we'll start with Ashland, Oregon. There's a lot of Ashlands in the country, so I'll scroll down to find the one that I'm looking for. And when you click on it, you get to a page like this. There are several tabs in Wildfire Risk to Communities, and they all look the same. They've got the same kind of layout. On the left-hand side, you can see a headline statement and a chart, and on the right-hand side is a map. You'll notice at the top the name of your community is shown here, and we've got some breadcrumbs, so you can link back out to the county or to the state and get data for those geographies if you're interested in sort of zooming in or zooming out. But I'm going to go back so that we can look at Ashland specifically. The first tab you come to is called Risk to Homes, and this tab provides information about the potential risk to structures if a fire were to occur. The headline statement here is telling us that populated areas in the city of Ashland have, on average, greater risk than 70% of the communities in Oregon. And the map is showing us the distribution of that risk across the landscape. The scatter plot is showing us where Ashland sits relative to other communities in Oregon. So every dot represents a community. The larger the dot, the greater the population. And you can see as I mouse over communities in the scatter plot, I get more information about what those dots represent. The communities are plotted in the scatter plot of wildfire likelihood increasing to the right. So that's the probability that a wildfire would occur against the consequence of wildfire. And that's really a generalized susceptibility that incorporates the potential intensity of wildfire and the potential damage to a structure if a wildfire were to occur. And that's one of the really unique things about this website compared to some other wildfire risk data that you might encounter, is that the focus here on these data is really on risk to homes. It's on the structures in our communities. It's not about landscape conditions. We're not factoring in other resources that might be impacted by wildfire, like watersheds or transmission lines or other kinds of infrastructure like transportation. This data is really focused on the risk to homes and structures. You'll notice that the default is that we're comparing the city of Ashland to other communities in the state of Oregon, but I can change that. I can look at communities compared within my county or across the nation. And as I do that, you'll see that the colors on the map change and the scatter plot changes. In states like Oregon and California, where there's a lot of widespread wildfire risk, when you're comparing just within your state, you might have a little bit lower risk, and as you compare to the whole country, you might see that risk increase. So here, Ashland was at 70% compared to the state of Oregon, but when we compare across the whole nation, it's a higher risk at 84%. And again, you can mouse over these dots in the scatter plot to see what other communities' risk may be. So I want to show you the next tab, which is called exposure type. And this really gets at something that you heard from Chris and from Justice about the risk from embers in communities, not just the risk of adjacent wildland vegetation, but also the risk of ember cast coming into your community and igniting vulnerable structures or landscaping around homes. On this map and chart, what you're looking at in the red are areas that are directly exposed to wildfire because they're adjacent to flammable vegetation. The areas shown in orange are indirectly exposed to wildfire from ember cast. You can see basically the entire city of Ashland here has wildfire exposure, even though it may not all be adjacent to flammable vegetation. And that's because embers can travel a mile or more away from a wildfire. And we know that embers are responsible for the vast majority of home loss in wildfires in our country. You can also toggle the map. The default is to show all lands wall to wall, every inch of the landscape, but you can choose to show populated areas only, and that will help you zero in on where existing structures may be on the landscape and the kinds of exposure or risk that they're confronted with. The third tab on wildfire risk to communities is called wildfire likelihood, and this maps and charts out the probability of a wildfire occurring. So you can see the distribution of the propensity or the likelihood of wildfire across the landscape. Again, a scatter plot showing you relative to other communities and a map showing you the distribution. And finally, the last tab is called vulnerable populations. And right now, this tab has just a locator map. We're working on adding some mapped data into this piece of the website. But right now, we've got just tabular data over here on the left. And this piece of the website is really helping to demonstrate and sort of surface where there are people who may be made more vulnerable to wildfire because they may have a lack of access to resources. They may lack the physical ability to modify their homes or respond or recover from wildfire. And they may have faced cultural or institutional barriers that make it difficult to access aid for recovery or for mitigation. These data all come from the American Community Survey, and they're provided in both the absolute number for your community as well as the percentage in your community. And I just want to mention briefly that Headwaters Economics has developed a report that provides a lot more detail about these data, including some more interpretation and sort of context around why these data points might be important. And I'll provide a link to that a little bit later, so you can go look at those reports if that's of interest to you. Wildfire Risk to Communities was developed in 2000. It was launched in April 2000, right at the beginning of the pandemic. And we've had a couple of updates since then. We are working on a pretty significant update for 2022. And we'd love to hear from you as you start to play around with and use the tool if you have ideas or suggestions for improvements. And I mention that here because we know that we will be adding some new features to this section of the website in the next release in 2022. I want to point out that there are a lot of terms in this tool that are underlined. You can see a little faint underline. And when you click on those terms, you get a short glossary definition that provides some context around what we mean in this tool by these different terms. There is a lot of jargon associated with wildfire risk, and we've tried to simplify that as much as possible and provide more details if you're interested in learning more. You can click on a longer definition and a more detailed glossary will pop up that provides you with more context and information, and you can search the glossary for all the different terms where we've provided definitions. You can also access the glossary from the upper right-hand corner of the website here, and you'll notice that there's also a download button. When you click on that, you go to a different section of the website, where you can access all of the GIS files behind the data at wildfirerisk.org. There's over 15 different raster data sets that we're making available here so that you can grab them and incorporate them into your own plans and analyses. The city of Ventura, for example, is working on its general plan. If you're thinking about updating your CWPP or hazard mitigation plans, you can grab these data, use them, and incorporate them into your own planning processes and tools. So we've got descriptions of all the data layers and access to download the data, all here from the download part of the website. And then finally, I want to point out that from all the tabs and all the pages, we're providing access to the reduce risk section of the website. You can see on the menu at the top, we have a link that says take action. And that takes you to this part of the website where we're providing links, videos, handouts, tools, all kinds of resources to help communities take steps to become better fire adapted. As I mentioned, this really builds on the cohesive strategy. We've tried to provide resources that address all three components: wildfire response, fire adapted communities, and resilient landscapes. And within each of these sections, when you click on them and go into the website, you'll find more information about the components of wildfire risk. You'll find handouts, infographics, resources that you can use as a community to better understand your own risk, but also to communicate with your constituents about wildfire risk. And then finally, we provide a lot of links to community tools. In many cases, these are partner organizations that provide technical assistance, funding, and can help you become a better fire adapted community with resources and assistance. So I hope you'll explore those sections of the website. And we also provide some reading with links to the best available science about these topics if you are interested in really digging in and doing your own research. So wildfirerisk.org is relatively new. It's only a year old. We are really interested in your feedback. You can subscribe to newsletters here. We send them 3 or 4 times a year with just updates about what's happening at wildfirerisk.org. And we're, as I said, very interested in your feedback, especially as we get ready to launch version 2 sometime in 2022. With that, I will hand it back to Erica for the Q&A. We're looking forward to the discussion.
Wonderful. Kelly, thank you so much for that kind of tour of that fantastic tool. And I think, you know, we're seeing even in the comments that this analysis, especially the GIS part, could have saved so much time from some of these local agencies that are working to do this very thing in their communities and understand sort of some of the data that will help inform the policies, help inform the decisions, and help mitigate that risk, especially the vulnerable populations that you identified and sort of the demographic information. So really, really helpful, and we're looking forward to diving in even more with questions. So we have reached the Q&A portion of this webinar, and so we're going to ask all of our panelists to come back on video to take a few more of these audience questions, and we are so grateful to those of you that have already sent in a number of questions on the questions box. As a reminder, our panelists are Hank Adams, the City Administrator for the City of Ashland, Oregon. He's been in public service for more than 27 years, serving in a lot of departments at the City of Ashland. Chris Chambers, he's the leader of Ashland's FireWise Communities and Fire Adapted Communities program. He manages Ashland's municipal forest lands. He's nationally recognized for his work in fire adaptation and wildfire protection, and serves on the Southern Oregon Forest Restoration Collaborative and the Governor's Wildfire Response Council. Frank Fay, who you haven't met yet, but he is now on the screen. He's a fire ecologist in the Fuels and Fire Ecology Program with the United States Forest Service. Mary Joyce Ivers is a Deputy Director of Public Works with the City of Ventura. She's also the President of the American Public Works Association, and she has more than 27 years of experience in public works and oversees the first responders effort that she talked about with the 2017 Thomas Fire in California. And then Justice Jones, we heard from him. He is from the City of Austin. He is the Wildfire Mitigation Officer. And then Kelly Pale is the Associate Director of Headwaters Economics and has been giving us that test drive of that new online tool that local agencies can use to identify some of the data necessary to really make strong and important and right decisions related to this topic. So, as I mentioned, We have been collecting your questions throughout this presentation, and we're going to continue to do so during this portion as well. So if you have questions, we will do our best to get to them. Though I will tell you there are quite a few in the queue. If for some reason we do not get to your question before the end of the webinar, what we will do is we will try and reach out to you after the session, or we'll make sure that we share the email addresses that are available for our panelists so you can reach out to them if they are available. So we'll do our best to make sure that all of the topics and all of the questions get covered. So let us dive right in. And while we have some really interesting kind of framing questions, I want to make sure we hit the questions from our attendees. And so one of the first questions that we got, and we thought was really interesting, is, and all of you certainly can't answer, but one of you, if you feel like you can, how do you or how did you decide between improving disaster preparation and disaster response? It's a discrepancy, and I think there's an interest in learning a little bit more about your approach for that. Can one of you speak to that?
Okay, I'll go. I think when we did our after action report, you're really evaluating how we had responded, what we needed to do, what resources we need. And I think it's always continuous improvement, evaluating what did we get right, what do we need the resources to improve upon. So it's what we need to do to protect our communities. So it's continually evaluating how our policies and procedures are set up and looking for those improvements and getting the community input. Where did we let them down? Where do they feel that we did a good job, and including that in our plans.
Wonderful, thank you so much. We do know that some of you are taking advantage of controlled burning. And there's a question that's come in about air quality concerns. How do you consider and incorporate air quality metrics and concerns in regard to your controlled burn planning? Chris, I think if you're taking that one, you're on mute.
Is Chris going? I can talk about it a little bit.
Oh, so great, go for it, yeah.
The Forest Service does a lot of control burning, and we work closely with the state air quality boards to determine which are the best days to do a burn, so that when there's smoke, it moves away from the community and it disperses as best as possible. We also do quite a bit of community monitoring and set up smoke detectors, not smoke detectors, but air quality monitoring devices that tell us when the levels are getting too high and provide warnings to vulnerable populations so that they can take mitigation with their own assets to get out of the community or to stay inside and offer those warnings in the media.
Wonderful, thank you for that. Hi, Chris.
Can I chime in if you can hear me now?
Yeah, you're good. Your audio is a little scratchy, but we can hear you for the most part.
Okay, Ashland has been really aggressive in burning and burning really close to and inside the city boundaries. So we've had to develop a program which we called SmokeWise Ashland, which we've got a website, smokewiseashland.org, in collaboration with our local Chamber of Commerce and other community organizations. We do send out smoke alerts and burn alerts ahead of any burn operations that we're doing. But we created that page as a resource for the community so they would know how to protect themselves. We've done a lot of targeted outreach to vulnerable communities. Recently got a grant from the State Department of Environmental Quality where we distributed 600 HEPA air quality purifiers out into the community, but targeted at low income and vulnerable residents with health issues. So it's been something that we realized we had to do in order to have a successful burn program. And then it doubles that education and awareness in the summer when we have dense smoke episodes from regional wildfires or local wildfires. Encourage folks to check out that website.
That is excellent, and we'll ask you for that link so that when we send out follow-up information to all the registrants, that they can include that in that information. You brought up a really interesting point, because a lot of the communities that we serve have a mix of residents, and some are harder to reach and others are harder to evacuate. And certainly we want to make sure that we're incorporating all of those dynamics into our plans. Can one or two of you talk about how you're incorporating equity into your wildfire planning? And that could be however you define it, right? It could be making sure that you've got the language access, or making sure that you've got physical access and support, and certainly partnerships. What are some of the things that you're doing to address that important issue?
Erica, I can speak to some of our efforts in Austin and Central Texas. We're a very diverse community. We're very proud of that diversity. It's one of the things that makes it so interesting and such a vibrant community. We want to make sure that we are reaching all populations that are vulnerable to wildfire. So we've done a lot of work internally and with external partners to develop materials to reach those vulnerable populations that may need to hear things in their own way. For one example, we worked with the International Association of Fire Chiefs to translate the Ready, Set, Go guide into Spanish, our second predominant language in Austin. In addition to that, we worked with our Homeland Security and Emergency Management and through our Wildfire Coalition Task Group to translate all of our evacuation mailers into over 7 languages that reach populations in our community. One of the most effective tools that we've employed is in partnership with Headwaters Economics, where we developed a wildfire and vulnerability viewer. That allows us to look at things like people's ability to be resilient and recover from the impacts of wildfire, not just who's most physically at risk. And so we use that tool to help dial in our outreach. There's also components of it where we can make sure that when we do prescribed burning like Ashland, that we're identifying sensitive populations that maybe are higher risk for COPD and other respiratory related illnesses. And so we work really hard to bring equity to Austin. We've also changed the way we analyze risk. We have 2 types of fire environments. A woodland environment, like Chris mentioned, is traditional perspective wildfire risk, and grasslands. So both how fast fires spread in grasslands and how intense they can be in those wildlands to illustrate a more county and city-wide risk, not just the big bad woodland fires, but the fast-moving grass fires that often reach homes before firing resources can get ahead of those fires. So that really expanded our footprint of wildfire risk to include many vulnerable populations across the city, and we're excited to keep working to expand those efforts.
Thank you. That was a really fantastic overview, and I think there's a lot of things that many of you have mentioned that you're doing in the context of equity. I'm sure there's more you could share, and I'm grateful to Justice for giving us that really great overview. We're going to keep moving because we're getting lots of questions in, and I just want to try and get as many of them peppered through as possible. The next question is actually just a follow-up on a comment that one of you made during your panel presentation, which was about the 3 pieces of a wildfire cohesive strategy. We did mention one was resilient landscapes. Can one of you talk about what number 2 and number 3 are, just so that our panelists are fully informed on that?
Chris, I can take the fire adapted communities component if you'd like to handle effective firefighting force. Our goal with Austin being fire adapted is 0 wildland fire fatalities. Life safety is our highest priority in the fire department, and we want to ensure that that remains the highest priority as we're moving forward. We know the way to protect the most of our public as possible is to ensure that we have communities that are hardened and resistant to ignition. And so adopting regulations that help reinforce and build regulation into the culture of the community becomes part of what we do. Things like adopting the Wildland Urban Interface Code, but that's not enough. We have to work with communities that are experiencing existing risk, retrofit their homes and their landscapes, prepare themselves for wildfire as we try to get ahead of the curve by adopting regulations. So that's really the key, is to have grassroots engagement and to align that with the regulatory environment. And so you don't continue to build and grow in ways that put your community at risk. You head that off the pass while you're trying to help other community members catch up.
And then I'll touch on the other third leg of that stool, which is safe and effective wildfire response. Critical in this day and time when fire intensity and the movement of fires is putting firefighter lives at risk every time that we respond on a grass brush or any kind of wildfire. that the social contract between citizens and the fire service is something that we kind of, citizens especially, take for granted. And on the responder side, we don't take it for granted. But the expectation that firefighters are going to risk their lives to save homes and property is sometimes pretty unrealistic. And folks have to realize that to actually have safe and effective response, the mitigation piece has to really be successful, and the community has to embrace it if they want that expectation that firefighters are going to put their lives on the line when the fire bell goes off and we see smoke in the air. So, part of it is that that managing those expectations, making them realistic, but then relating that piece to the fire adapted communities and resilient landscapes pieces, because they're in the cohesive strategy, there's overlap in all those pieces. And then the middle of that is also making sure that it's informed by the best science that we have to make people safe and to create those resilient, healthy landscapes.
Thank you for both of you for answering that. And I've gotten quite a few questions about vegetation and landscape, and we're going to jump to those in a second, but I wanted to flag a question for Mary Joyce, specifically related to the city of Ventura and how you've brought residents into the conversation as it relates to, really being aware and being conscious and being prepared. How has that helping neighbors portion of the effort helped you, Mary Joyce, deal with the wildfires in Ventura?
Well, I think we have a very caring and involved community. We've got community councils. We have 7 districts within our city organization, and we meet with our community councils. And then during our general plan process, reaching out to all our stakeholders, bilingual, either electronically or when we can get in the same room. It's been an interesting process virtually, but I think we're able to reach more people because we've gotten used to this virtual world, but it makes it easier for people to get together. But I know we've had, past community meetings, getting input from the different citizens, our vulnerable area, really engaging with our community services throughout our city. I know we have a lot of, you talk about the vulnerable areas, we have the agricultural community as well as reaching out to those people. So there was plans put in place as to how we could communicate effectively with them and get them the right information. It's just been really good to see what people think, and we're listening and we're gathering all the information and we're getting assistance by helping with getting our plan put together.
Excellent, thank you for that. There are a couple of questions, as I mentioned, about vegetation, and some of you touched on some of the policies and codes that you've identified for landscaping and changing some of the vegetation management efforts. And one question that came in was one that we're seeing a lot in California related to those older communities where landscaping includes a lot of trees that are present. And part of the reason many people move into spaces that might not be as safe is because they love the visual aspects, the aesthetic aspects of all the trees that are present, and they don't want to remove those mature trees. And it's also very expensive. What are you all recommending based on not only policy, but in terms of implementation of that policy and just general public will around some of the visuals related to removal of trees and fuels reduction?
Well, I can jump in first on that one, and maybe some other folks want to follow up, but that's been a really central point of what we're doing here in Ashland and trying to essentially retrofit our community, just like you described, Erica, from that question. Basically, we don't advocate for removing mature trees. Most mature trees can survive fire, especially here where we have a lot of our native vegetation still in our community. What we do advocate for is pruning up those trees to make them safe, getting the branches away from the fuels from below them, getting the branches away from the roof lines and away from homes. And then, smaller trees, yeah. And then there's a few trees, and especially one, Leland cypress, that we do advocate for removing. Because they are really, really flammable. And we've had actually a lot of success getting grant money and working with Firewise communities to remove rows of Leland cypress that, 20 years ago, the thing was to plant rows of them for privacy, and people put them really close to houses, and there's just no way to make those trees safe. So on a situation by situation basis, sometimes we would advocate for that, but by and large, we really want to maintain our mature trees. And it's actually been shown that broadleaf trees can be protective during firestorms and shield homes from embers. So, you know, to advocate for taking out healthy maples and other trees like that, that really doesn't follow the best science. So kind of tuning in to your native vegetation in your area, making sure you know what people are commonly using in ornamental plants and trees, and being able to advocate for what is really effective and appropriate is really important. And I think most folks will find that they're surprised that they can keep their big trees, and they're happy when fire officials say that it's a good thing that they've got those.
Fantastic.
Erica, if I can add to that.
Yeah.
Urban forestry management is very critical in our community, and it is important. We do love our mature trees and looking at different trees when they need to be replaced. It is that wonderful balance with our climate. We need trees. We need that for our air quality and such. But also with our utility companies, they are putting this effort with their public safety power protection. They are going in and trimming the trees where we have overhead lines and helping make it more fire resilient. So they are doing that to help our community. So that's another piece of what we're doing.
Fantastic. Thank you both. Let's jump quickly to risk to structures. One of the people on the line is asking how you balance the idea that it makes more sense to build a vacation home for someone than a first home for a family that really needs it, right? How do you balance that in terms of what you've incorporated into your plans and maybe what you've incorporated into what's acceptable or not, and what's being considered the priority? Anyone dealing with that issue in their communities and or with their policies? It's a tough one. I think we've stumped our panel. Kelly.
I can maybe offer a data resource on this. So the report that I mentioned that Headwaters Economics has developed about wildfire risk, that pulls data from wildfire risk to communities as well as from the census and other sources, provides a lot of detailed information about potentially vulnerable populations. And it also has some data about housing characteristics, including the share of housing that's owned by second homeowners or absentee homeowners, the share of mobile homes, and housing that's vacant seasonally. And that is a helpful data point, I think, for a lot of communities in really understanding the scope of the problem. How many homeowners do you have that might be absentee? And in a separate program, the Headwaters Economics has been partnering with the Forest Service for over 6 years now through a program called Community Planning Assistance for Wildfire. We've had the good fortune to work with both Austin and Ashland, and actually more than 80 communities across the country. And this is a problem that comes up a lot. How do you work with second homeowners on education and mitigation? And we actually have developed a guide with some suggestions for how you can reach second homeowners or absentee homeowners that might be seasonal or more difficult to get a hold of. That's not, and I realize I'm not answering the question, how you weigh those priorities. That is a pretty political question, I think. But I would say that it is highly variable across the country. There is, I think, a perception in some places that areas that are wildfire prone are occupied by wealthier residents, a lot of second homeowners, and that is true in some places. But in a lot of places, that's also not true. In a lot of places, there are the wildland urban interface or wildfire prone landscapes are not occupied by wealthier people or absentee homeowners. And it's important to know in your community, who are the people that live in these fire prone landscapes. And so that's where I think some of these data can help.
Thank you, Kelly. And you're right, the data will help shape some of the policy and even the approach. And so we really appreciate that. We have not too much time left, so I want to take two more questions, and one of them is related to funding. Have any of you integrated or found funding sources related to this mitigation that you can share that have worked for you, like funding approaches and funding programs that you're currently taking advantage of, or that you encourage others to look forward to as they're beginning this process or embarking on it?
Maybe I'll hit a little bit and Chris can follow up. For Ashland, we've, for quite a number of years, we're our own electric, water, wastewater utilities. So we have a pretty robust billing system. We've added a fee, and we've explicitly labeled it for wildfire. I think that's a key piece, is when you are kind of creating a revenue stream, that it's really clear what it is and what it's being used for. I think that's an element that we've used on our bill. And then we've also, because what we're protecting, a portion of what we're trying to protect and work on is in our watershed, we do use our water utility, does contribute to that, because it does have crossover to our water supply, our water quality, and just water security as well. So those are two areas that we've utilized over the long haul. And of course, as I mentioned in my opening, the another value of having quality staff is the ability to find other funding streams in the grant world. But those were the two kind of primary dedicated ongoing local community revenue streams, and they've been very successful at kind of showing that we're putting our own money locally, money where our mouth is. And that does help when we are securing grants, to say that is part of our match. We are putting our own local funds towards the effort.
Fantastic, thank you for that. So I will just move to our last question, and it's one that maybe more than one of you can answer, but so many of you talked about collaboration and importance of that coordination across not only jurisdictional lines, but also with community partners and others, and really engaging the full community in your resilience planning efforts. And that does require comprehensive and integrated approaches. So are there any suggestions that you have for our panelists in this final closing question for facilitating public engagement for these planning efforts? And that can include stakeholder engagement, right? The general public, but then also some of those other key stakeholders that are really important and necessary for making policy and codes and enforcement effective.
Erica, I think it's critical to address at all levels, from leadership down to the grassroots level, to really have a comprehensive approach to wildfire mitigation. Without that leadership support, staff and departments won't get the resources and direction that they need to support their community. And without the community doing their portion to respond to the threat of wildfire, we're only solving a limited portion of the equation. So my recommendation is that you engage stakeholders and cooperators at every level of government and community that you can, including non-traditional partners like universities, other partnering agencies outside of your jurisdiction. And for us, a really big benefit has been to be involved in things like the Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network, where we have access to great individuals like Chris Chambers and others who may have had experience in areas that we haven't had. So don't try to do this in a vacuum. Learn from others that have maybe been on this path a little bit longer, or dealt with issues that you can maybe potentially avoid. And I think ultimately the key is ongoing collaboration. Anytime in Austin where we kind of slide out of that model, we're reminded that this is a complex, and collaboration is going to be successful and move forward together.
Fantastic, thank you, Justice. And we're actually going to steal that link from you if you'll send it to us, to make sure if there are ways and resources that you all have, or any of you have, that we can include in our follow-up email to the registrants, where they can maybe join in to some existing listservs or groups, or and connect with experts. Please do share that with us. I know Mary Joyce mentioned, there is an informal network in California of people helping people, and leaders helping leaders, and that's so important for this, as we're all in it together. And there's certainly some key learnings you've all experienced and that you've kind of started to impart on us today. But there are so many other experts and so much other guidance that we certainly would want other communities to have as they begin this journey. All right, so we are running up against our time, and so I do want to move into the wrap up, and I will just ask for all of our panelists, I want to thank you all for your time, and we will certainly, if you are open to it, make sure that some of the questions that are still remaining in our Q&A box will get routed to you all, and if you have the opportunity to answer those, we would welcome that participation, and so we can follow up with all of the attendees today with some of their specific questions. Some were very specific, and we love the idea of having that follow-up happen. So as we move into our closing, I just want to go in and ask and hope that you will all stay connected with all of the organizations that are represented here on this webinar today. If you go to the next slide, you'll see that there are some links for all of the larger organizations, and then also for this Wildfire Risk to Communities tool. And what we're going to do when we send the follow-up email to all registrants is we'll make sure to include some of the other links that people have referenced in their comments today to make sure that you have access to some of those key, not only content and research and reports, but also maybe some communities, right, of experts and other like-minded officials that are looking to move in this direction and support one another. Next slide. I think I mentioned this earlier, but the recording for this webinar will be available soon, and we will share it electronically with everyone who registered for our session today to make sure that if you couldn't join in live, that you have the opportunity not only to join in at a later date and at your leisure, but also to share this with those that you know in your communities that might want to hear and see this as well. So we hope you will share that moving forward, and you look for that link in the next few days. Next slide. This does conclude our webinar, and I want to thank all of you and all of our wonderful panelists for your time today, for providing so much information and just content to our attendees. I want to thank the registrants certainly for spending time to be with us, and it has truly been an honor to have you join us. And on behalf of my webinar co-hosts at NLC and Headwaters Economics and the entire team at the Institute for Local Government, we do hope that you will have a fantastic rest of your day. Thank you so much for spending your time with us on this Thursday.
Thank you, Erica.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.